So there were several major events that happened during the Red Power movement, the first of which was the occupation of Alcatraz. So it began on November 3rd, 1969, and it ended June 11th, 1971. And it was the first major action by the Red Power movement. So Alcatraz Island is an island off the coast of California. Um, that was a major high security prison for the United States. However, historically it was Native American land, and it was very important Native American land. So in 1969, 80 Native American students landed on Alcatraz Island and occupied it. And at this time, I believe the prison had been shut down. However, it was still considered federal land. And they justified the occupation with the Sioux Treaty, that stated that all out-of-use land was native land. So they said that since the prison was no longer functioning, it was once again native land, and they should have jurisdiction over it. And the occupation was incredibly successful. For almost 3 years, there was a huge Native American community on there, and they practiced like communism, like they lived essentially in a commune, in which they shared responsibility for meals, chores, and they showed that treaties had to be honored. And the point of the protest was really that the treaties had to be honored, and that they couldn't just be ignored whenever the US government decided that it wanted more land or that it didn't like Native Americans anymore. Another major event was the occupation of DQ University. So DQ University was a piece of land, actually, when it was first occupied. So Native American youth had applied for possession of some military surplus land near Davis, California, and they were denied the land, and it was instead given to UC Davis, even though UC Davis hadn't completed the application for it. So in retaliation in 1970, the students occupied the land that they were denied, and they founded DQ University. And it was the first tribal university established in California that wasn't affiliated with one reservation. So it wasn't like this tribe's university, it was a Native American university. And they finally received a deed in April 1971. And from 1971 to 2005, it was part of the tribal colleges and universities, and it was accredited in 1977. And the curriculum focused on cultural and traditional elements to educate Native students on their heritage. So the Trail of Broken Treaties was one of the most significant events of this time period. So starting August 1972, 7 caravans of Native Americans began moving from the West Coast to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. And throughout the way, they protested different broken treaties and different treaty violations that the U.S. government had perpetuated. On November 1st, protesters began arriving in D.C. to bring 20 demands to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and protesters ended up taking over the building and barricading the doors. So on the right here, you can see different protesters inside the Bureau of Indian Affairs staging a sit-in and protesting the BIA and demanding that they accept their demands. So this occupation began November 2nd, 1972, the week before the presidential election. And supporters formed a barricade outside the building as well to prevent police from evicting the activists. And after lawyers found evidence of BIA corruption and were able to bring them to justice and stop them from continuing to take advantage of Native peoples, the protesters left. So once their demands had been met, and once they were able to prove that the BIA was corrupt. So Wounded Knee was one of the most significant events of this period. So the Wounded Knee incident, led by AIM, began on February 27th, 1973, and ended May 8th, 1973. So, more than 200 Native Americans in support of the Oglala Sioux people took over Wounded Knee, South Dakota. And they chose Wounded Knee as a tribute to the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, when hundreds of Native Americans were slaughtered by American troops. So they began by taking over trading posts that resold native crafts and commercialized the Wounded Knee Massacre. They felt that these trading posts were racist and disrespectful, and they instead started selling Native American crafts that were made by Native American artisans. And it sent the message that Native Americans would not sit around as treaties were broken. So federal agents gathered around Wounded Knee, and AIM promoted their cause through the media. Um, Agents and protesters would often have shootouts at night. Um, 2 Native Americans died, and one federal agent was paralyzed in these shootouts. May 8th, 1973, Native Americans surrendered to the federal agents in return for a Senate investigation into broken Native treaties and the BIA, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So, the aftermath. The Red Power movement succeeded at many of its goals before its decline in the late 1970s. It brought awareness to tribal issues and spread knowledge about Native American culture. Many laws were passed during or after the movement that allowed for Native American self-determination. And although many strides were made, there was still much work to be done. So I just want to finish with this quick exit slip. Do you believe the Red Power movement was successful? Why or why not? Do you think societal change mostly occurs within or without established systems? Why? So, before you pause the video to think, I just want to point out these photos. On the left is a photo of an AIM protest, and on the right is a modern day protest of by Indigenous peoples, I believe in Canada. So just pause the video and think about this exit slip for a moment. Okay. So, do you believe the Red Power movement was successful? Why or why not? Ultimately, I think it was partially successful. It succeeded at some of its goals. It got the Bureau of Indian Affairs investigated. It fought against the various treaties being broken. But ultimately, I don't think it was very successful because after the movement ended, Native American issues stopped being fought for by people outside of Native American groups. So it didn't really succeed at bringing these issues to the mainstream, which I think is why this history is so important, because we need to learn about these protests and what they were fighting for, and we need to continue to fight for them. Do I think societal change mostly occurs within or without established systems? Why? I think ultimately societal change starts from outside the system. Every protest movement that has achieved something has fought from outside the system, because protest movements are started by those prevented from working within the system. Once change and the fight for change starts outside a system, the allies and sympathizers within the system can begin to make small changes. But without that initial push from outside a system, I don't think change happens. So once again, I will link the primary source document in the description, and thank you so much for joining me for today's lesson.